I don't know about you, but one of my favorite things in cooking is when a concept can be broken down into a simple, easy to follow formula. So that basically by learning one method, you can create an infinite number of dishes. And all you have to do is switch out a few ingredients. In fact, the formula we're gonna talk about today, which you can use to create an infinite number of spiced rice dishes, can be broken down into just 3 basic stages: building flavor, cooking, and finishing. So if we look at the way a beginner might cook rice, it's often just a matter of combining water, rice, and maybe some salt and then cooking it. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I mean, in some cases, that plain rice might actually be what you want. But when we want rice that can stand on its own a bit more, we can add just a few more steps to the process. And in doing so, we can make our rice infinitely more interesting and open the door to so much more variety. And it all starts with the first stage, which I like to call building flavor. So in our beginner rice making process, this step doesn't exist. The beginner starts out just by adding the rice and water to the pot, and so the only flavor they have is the flavor from the rice itself. So if we really want to take our rice to the next level, this is where we'll start. Essentially, rather than adding the rice and water straight to the pot, we're gonna start by creating a rich, flavorful base that we can build everything else on top of. And we'll do that by first heating a small amount of fat in a pot over about a medium heat. Now this can be any type of fat, so you can use olive oil if you're making a Mediterranean rice dish, butter or ghee if you're making an Indian dish, or a neutral oil if you're making a Mexican rice dish, for example. And if you're not sure which types of fat go well with which cuisines, the book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat has a great diagram showing exactly that. So that's my go-to resource when I need a little reminder, but when in doubt, I just use a neutral tasting oil because I know it's not gonna clash with any of the other flavors I use. Either way, from there we'll just add some aromatics and or veggies along with a pinch of salt. And honestly, about 90% of the time, I just use onion here. It's easy, it adds a lot of flavor, and it'll work well in pretty much any rice dish. But you could also add some garlic, ginger, or even things like carrots and bell peppers if you like. So again, just like with the fat, try to use ingredients that play well with whatever cuisine you're making. Now aside from which ingredients you use, you can also play around with how thoroughly you cook those ingredients. Specifically with onions, whether you cook them for 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10, 15, or even longer, can have a pretty big impact on the flavor of your dish. And speaking of flavor, let's talk about fat. Namely, why do we need to start with fat in the first place? Well, I'm glad you asked. Basically, fat is an extremely efficient carrier of flavor, much more so than water or any other liquid that we'll be cooking our rice in. And to prove it, here's a quick little experiment that you can perform at home. First, cook a spice of your choosing in a neutral oil for about 30 seconds. In this case, I'm using Aleppo pepper. Then cook that same spice in water for 30 seconds. Then strain out each of the liquids and give them a taste, of course after waiting for them to cool, and you'll see that the oil carries a lot more of the original flavor of the spice, whereas the water just tastes sort of like a weak, spicy tea. And that's because number one, the flavor compounds within spices and herbs are fat soluble, so the fat does a great job of absorbing and holding onto those flavors. Now for alliums like garlic and onion, those flavors are actually water soluble, so you won't see quite as big of a difference there. But the other advantage of fat is that it also coats your tongue a lot more effectively than water, so that leads to a much better mouthfeel and a much better overall flavor. So starting with even just a small amount of oil and then infusing some flavor into that oil will have a huge impact on the final flavor of your dish. But anyways, once you've cooked down the aromatics to your liking, it's time to add some spices. And this is where you can really shape the flavor of your dish. At this point, we can turn it into an Indian style rice by adding some cumin, cardamom, cloves, and cinnamon, a Middle Eastern style rice by adding some cumin, paprika, turmeric, and bay leaf, or you can even add something as simple as a pinch of cinnamon and some black pepper like I did in the Lebanese rice from last week's video. And even something that small will go a surprisingly long way due to the flavor carrying power of our oil. So I will leave a few of my favorite spice combos in the description below, but really this is the fun part, so you can just experiment and see what you like best. And the book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat has another nice diagram for spices, along with one for acids, which for copyright reasons I probably shouldn't keep showing, but I think it's an essential book for beginning home cooks, so I definitely recommend you check it out. Of course, I'll leave a link in the description below. Anyways, now we'll just want to toast the spices for about 30 seconds to give the flavor some more time to infuse into the oil. And at that point, we can finally add the rice. Now my last tip in this first flavor building phase is to toast the rice for about 30 seconds, being sure to stir that entire time. So this number one adds a bit of toasty flavor to the rice, but it also just allows the rice to become thoroughly coated in the spices and the flavorful oil. Then after those 30 seconds, we can finally add the liquid, at which point we've officially started the cooking phase. And this cooking phase is the easiest part because you can really just cook the rice as you normally would. So I'll show you how I like to do it, but before we get into that, let's let's talk about types of rice. And apparently there's over 100,000 varieties of rice in the world, but for the most part, they can all be broken down into one of three basic categories: short grain, medium grain, and long grain. And for this formula we're discussing today, long grain rice works best. It's light and fluffy when cooked since the grains tend to remain more separate, and it's a very fragrant rice that takes well to the addition of spices. Now, medium grain rice is more moist and tender than long grain, and it's also slightly clingy, so it lends itself well to creamier dishes like risotto. And then short grain rice is the softest and stickiest of them all, so that's typically used in sushi and other applications where you want the rice to cling to itself in masses. But as far as long grain rice, the two most common varieties you'll see are jasmine and basmati. And that's for good reason. They're both very aromatic and delicious rice varieties. But where jasmine rice is native to Thailand and tends to be a bit moist and clingy, basmati rice is native to India and it tends to be more fluffy and delicate, and it has even longer grains than jasmine rice. So for those reasons, I think basmati rice works best in this dish, but jasmine or any other long grain rice would work fine as well. So now that we've selected our rice, let's talk about how to actually cook it. And in my opinion, the key to making great rice is simply to use the proper ratio of rice to liquid. So if you take away just one thing from this video, that should be it. So many people use too much liquid when they cook rice, and that often leads to a mushy and clumpy final product. So for long grain rice, which actually requires the most liquid out of any type of rice, you only want to use about 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 parts liquid for every 1 part of rice. Any higher than that and your rice will just end up overly mushy and bloated. Now with that said, you may have also noticed that I'm talking in terms of liquid and not water. And that's because while you can use water to cook your rice, you certainly don't have to. And in fact, for this formula, I would encourage using something more flavorful like a chicken stock. If you have chicken stock on hand, or even just bouillon cubes, which you can use to make a sort of makeshift chicken stock, it requires almost no extra effort to just use that in place of water, and it's gonna make your rice a lot more interesting and more flavorful. Just note that if your stock already has salt in it, you wanna be careful not to add too much salt in other parts of the process. So enough of that, how do we actually cook the rice? Well, it can depend slightly on which type of rice you're using, but generally most long grain rices, where you wanna end up with a light and fluffy final product, are gonna follow the same process. So here's how I do it. First, I'll add my liquid and then bring the pot up to a boil. Then I'll stir and reduce the heat to low and then cover the pot and allow it to simmer for 15 to 18 minutes. After that time, I'll remove the pot from the heat and let it steam, still covered for another 5 minutes. After which point, I'll just fluff the rice with a fork or a spoon and then taste and adjust for seasoning as necessary. But we're not done yet because we still have to talk about the finishing stage. And basically what this stage consists of is adding a few extra ingredients to add some additional flavor and pizzazz to your rice. So the stage is technically optional, but it can make a huge difference, so I highly recommend it in most cases. And when it comes to these add-ins, you basically have 3 main options. The first is fat. Now of course we added fat at the beginning of the process, but by adding a little bit more of the same type of fat here at the end, we can give the rice a nice smooth glossy texture, which is going to improve the mouthfeel and make it that much more delicious. Now the next thing we can add is acid. Now again, you have a variety of choices here, so you could go with lime juice, lemon juice, vinegar, and so on, but the point is that adding a little bit of acid here at the end is going to give that rice just a little bit of zing to take it to the next level. Now I don't always add acid to my rice, but it really just depends on what I'm serving it with. So for example, if I'm serving it with chicken and a yogurt sauce, I may not add acid to the rice because the yogurt sauce is already going to provide that zing. Whereas if the rice is more of a main component of the dish, for example in a pilaf, I will add some acid to it so that the rice can stand on its own a bit more. Now the next things you may want to add in are some fresh herbs and or some toasted nuts and seeds. In my opinion, nearly any rice dish can benefit from the addition of chopped herbs for some extra freshness. And depending on the dish, some toasted nuts and seeds can be great as well, just to vary up the textures a bit and make your rice a lot more interesting. For example, in the Lebanese rice that I made in last week's video, toasted almonds are a great addition. So if you haven't seen that video yet, I recommend you check it out right here. It's a pretty simple application of this method, so it's a great place to start. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in that next video.